What's up, RotoBallers? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jorden Hill, and I'm back again to talk about some players that were a disappointment in Week 12 or have given you multiple weeks of underwhelming output. We'll get into what I think you should do with these guys going forward, but first, make sure you subscribe to RotoBaller to stay up to date with all of our latest fantasy football content as we head into the fantasy playoffs. Let's start things off with a running back who's probably causing the most concern this week. It's Dameon Pierce of the Houston Texans. The rookie followed up a disastrous Week 11 performance in which he had 10 carries for 8 yards, with a somehow even worse 5 carry for 8 yards showing in Week 12. Although he's had a few receptions in each game, it hasn't turned into much in the way of fantasy scoring. Pierce is really the product of a bad team with a bad offense and a bad defense, which is really just the worst possible recipe for a running back. The offense isn't putting him in a position to score, and the defense is giving up too many points for the offense to be able to rely on the ground game. I know, Pierce may have cost you wins over the last 2 weeks, but before you go ahead and rage drop him, take a deep breath and note that the Texans play the Cleveland Browns next week. Now, of course, Pierce could get game scripted out of this game if the Browns get out to an early lead, but I'm willing to take my chances one more time, as Cleveland has allowed the second most PPR fantasy points to running backs this season. I think he's a startable flex option next week, but if he fails to come through again, he's definitely a must bench after that. Another running back that just hasn't been the same as of late is ALVIN KAMARA of the New Orleans Saints. The 5-time Pro Bowler has just been really disappointing from a fantasy perspective ever since his 3-touchdown explosion all the way back in Week 8. The Saints' offensive production has been very up and down, and KAMARA has been rather inefficient on the ground over the past 5 weeks. The encouraging thing, though, is KAMARA's usage in the receiving game, which has been consistently solid all year long. He's averaging 6.5 targets per game, which gives him a really nice floor in PPR leagues. Sure, these floor performances aren't going to win you a fantasy matchup, but to be fair, KAMARA's schedule has been really difficult since Week 8. Things won't get much easier for him next week against Tampa Bay, but the good news is that KAMARA has a really awesome schedule to open the fantasy playoffs with matchups against Atlanta and Cleveland in Weeks 15 and 16. KAMARA is simply too involved and too talented to bench, and I think you just gotta roll with the punches, keeping him in your lineup every week. One final running back that I want to briefly discuss is BARKLEY. Now, similar to KAMARA, BARKLEY is simply too talented and too important to this Giants offense for you to bench in fantasy, but I am starting to get a little concerned. SAQUON salvaged his Thanksgiving Day performance with a touchdown, but lately he hasn't been nearly as efficient as he was towards the beginning of the season, and his schedule over the next 3 weeks is brutal, with 2 matchups against the Washington Commanders and 1 against the Eagles in between. The Eagles' run defense has been a little bit more vulnerable as of late, but the Commanders have been stout all season long, so I really wouldn't expect top-level RB1 performances from BARKLEY in these contests. Again, he's too talented for you to bench, but if your league doesn't have a trade deadline, or if it's a little bit later in the season, I kinda like the idea of seeing what you can get for BARKLEY, trying to flip him into another every-week starter with an easier upcoming schedule. Moving over to the wide receiver position, let's talk about a player who's currently tied for the league lead in drops, Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills. Davis is the definition of boom or bust at this point, as he has just as many performances outside of the top 50 fantasy wide receivers as he does inside the top 24. Davis also has a pretty difficult upcoming schedule, so it might be tough to trust him in starting fantasy lineups. I do think he can be deployed as a flex option with the potential to go off on any given week, but just be warned that he's about as touchdown dependent as it gets at this point. I would prefer to play a wide receiver that's giving me a little bit more consistency on a week-to-week basis, but that might not be available to you at this point in the season. Davis will continue to be a high-risk, high-reward play moving forward, and you certainly shouldn't drop him, as he's the wide receiver 2 for one of the best quarterbacks in football. The last player we'll talk about today is GALLUP of the Dallas Cowboys, who hasn't posted a single fantasy wide receiver 2 performance this season. GALLUP did finish with season highs in targets, receptions, and yards this past week, but it only amounted to just over 11 PPR fantasy points. Dallas's offense is firing on all cylinders right now, so I do think GALLUP could have a strong finish to the season if he remains Dak Prescott's secondary target. However, I am concerned that there could be competition on the way in the form of Odell Beckham Jr. There are a few other teams that Beckham is reportedly interested in, but all signs point to Dallas as being the early favorite to land him. Regardless, I think you can drop GALLUP, especially if there's an enticing option available on waivers, but I'm also okay with holding him at the end of your bench and seeing what happens over the next few weeks. That'll do it for Week 12. Please remember to leave a like if you enjoyed, and comment down below what players are giving you grief heading into Week 13. Thanks again for tuning in, and best of luck in your fantasy matchups.